welcome to the British Society of Criminology Hate Crime Network podcast. Your hosts today are Rachel Keithley and Dr. Irene Zempe, both who use she, her pronouns. In this podcast, we explore and respond to hate against marginalised communities. It's intended to facilitate the exchange of ideas and work amongst hate crime academics, stakeholders, policymakers, criminal justice practitioners, as well as the wider general public. Today's guest is Dr. Jack López. Jack uses he, him pronouns. Jack is currently Associate Dean of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Bradford and is an academic based at the Department of Peace Studies. He is a medical and social anthropologist specialising in barriers to healthcare, sexual health and care ethics. He's currently working on researching trans healthcare during COVID and collaborates with Trans Actual UK on a specific investigation on trans masculine lower surgeries and patient safety. So welcome to the podcast, Jack.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Really glad to have you here and to kick off this podcast series, because today we're going to be talking about a really current but important topic. We're going to be talking about trans rights within the UK context. So I think we'll be exploring what transphobia is, how it manifests, before discussing current and failing policy initiatives for the trans community. And finally, we'll share some recommendations for action. So how does that sound?
Sounds wonderful. I must say I'm looking forward to having this conversation in an environment where I don't feel that I need to be ready for battle.
Yeah, it must be very tiring at times, especially in the current climate. Yeah,
it can be. I think lots of people are getting to the point where we're becoming more selective in who we decide to have these conversations with. I think that's important, but yeah, we'll get into that shortly.
Yeah, really happy to be able to host this space for such an important conversation. So I think to start with, we should give some context to the listeners and start by defining what transphobia is and what hate against trans people is. So is that something you can give, a definition of that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important place to start as well. And it's, transphobia can mean different things to different people. And I would start off by saying, that if anybody feels that they are being subjected to transphobia, that's their subjective experience. And regardless of what definition I give, it's not necessarily something that you should deny somebody. If it's important to have definitions so we can have these discussions, so we can think about policy and legislation. But I think that there also always needs to be wiggle room, and we need to understand someone's experience is their experience. So I mean, really, I would thinking about this, and I would define transphobia as discrimination against any human being on the basis of them being or being perceived as transgender. So just like any other form of identity-based discrimination, whether that be sexism, racism, ableism, ageism, genderism, homophobia, it can occur overtly and directly as a form of violence towards an individual or a group of people. But it can only do so because it's enabled by structural and systemic inequalities brought about by a combination of social history, politics, capitalist economics, collective trauma or fear of another group of people. So what I'm saying there is we quite often think of something like transphobia, like other forms of discrimination, as a direct attack on somebody. But I think it's really important that, very similar to the way that we think about racism, to the way that we think about sexism, that it's enabled by structures of inequality. And I think when we start to look at the broader systems and structures in society, we're able to really get to the grips of what something like transphobia is.
I think that's an absolutely fantastic definition. I think I'm obviously only just entering the world of hate crime, but it's a definition that I've tried to grapple with in terms of the online space. And I think giving that background and the context of the structures of society that reinforce these marginalising beliefs is a really important point. Is there anything you wanted to add with your expertise, Irene?
No, I think it was a really in-depth definition and really captures the key issues around transphobia. On that point, I would like to ask Jack, how does transphobia manifest both in the physical space, but also in the online world? What forms does it take? You did mention discrimination, which is a core problem. Could you explain a little bit more how it is manifested? What forms, what examples can we think of online, but also offline in the physical space?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And what I'm going to do here actually is lean very much on my colleagues who I work with in Transactional UK, because they have spent a long time picking through and creating a resource that does exactly that. It tells us about how transphobia manifests. So in good citation practices, what I'm going to say now is that I am using the language and the interpretation that is on Transactional's website. There's a brilliant resource, and we can put that in your show notes as well, for how they describe how it manifests. And they've broken it down to kind of 5 different areas, really, where transphobia can manifest. They say that attempting to remove people's trans rights is one way within which it manifests, misrepresenting trans people, direct abuse, systematically excluding trans people from discussions about issues that directly affect them, and also they mention other forms of discrimination as well. So I'll just give some examples of those. So if we go back to the first manifestation, which is attempting to remove trans people's rights, a lot of this we can link to a lot of this happens online, actually, in the way this goes about. But it starts off as discussions, supposed debates, arguments online. But we've found very recently and over recent years, it very quickly trickles in to places like the Houses of Parliament and becomes shaped as evidence. So campaigning to remove rights from trans people has happened quite a lot online around so much ridiculous amount of misinformation about the Equality Act, what the Equality Act is and does, and what the Gender Recognition Act is and does. So there's a perfect example of how actually very clearly written legislation and policy that upholds it is taken to an online space where very often what we have are people, and these can be general members of the public, these can be famous people with a huge platform who are not very well educated or informed, and more, these can be people that actually work within the legal system themselves but have discriminatory politics, and lots of politicians who also have very discriminatory politics and aren't really well informed, and they misuse policy and legislation to try and create this kind of debate that is almost like a competition of rights, of who can have what. And it starts off as people arguing online, but as we've found out over the last years, and as I said, it's found its way into, recorded and documented debates in Parliament. It's also found its way into legal cases as well, particularly around young people's access to trans healthcare and all those kinds of things. So yes, the approach to attempting to remove trans people's rights, claiming that there's some kind of conflict between trans human rights and those of any other group. That's one very clear, obvious way that we've seen a rise in transphobia and transphobic action. And that's also inclusive of misrepresenting people who oppose trans people's rights as well. So there's a kind of shaping things as just a debate. We want to just have a conversation about we want to talk about women's rights, for example, and we're going to shape that in a particular way so that it sounds very innocent, but what we're basically doing is shoehorning a lot of transphobia in there, and we're doing that by using false evidence, misrepresentation of legislation, of policy, and downright lies a lot of the time as well, which somehow gets turned into facts in this strange kind of dystopian world that we're living in. We've got misrepresentation of trans people, and this is whether misuse of statistics, research, history, or the law, and presenting false images of trans people as a group. So trans people are often represented within the broader media as some kind of homogenous blob of people who are all the same, predominantly white people, predominantly able-bodied. There's a lack of there's poor representation, essentially, and this can cause forms of transphobia and transphobic attitudes towards people, particularly in terms of portraying trans people as a threat as well, as though we have no history, as though trans people have just suddenly popped out of nowhere and they're running around taking over everything. And a lot of that, and we get this a lot with in general with queer history, with LGBTQ history, minoritized people have been erased from history and documented history, and that is often used as a tool to be able to create kind of contemporary arguments about this group of people suddenly arriving and taking over. We see very similar discourse with migrants, with asylum seekers, with all different kind of groups of protected people as well. We've got the manifestations of physical assault and abuse, and this is also a connection of what happens online as well. We can start off with arguments, and there's been proof and research has shown this internationally as well as nationally, that a rise in transphobia and hate towards the trans community online and in the media translates to physical violence in the streets. It translates to people being attacked, being abused, or being shouted at in the streets. There is evidence of how that happens. It's argued it's argued very clearly that what happens a lot in terms of how those hate crimes come about as well is within also at the same time as there been increased abuse online, we've got this really positive element that there's actually an increase in representation of different types of trans people nowadays, on a lot of TV series, documentaries, radio, podcast, music. There's a lot of trans visibility, and with increased visibility also becomes increased threat. And there's been arguments around the past that where people see famous trans or gender non-conforming people are out of reach. They're not seen as people that you can have a conversation with on a daily basis. Somebody else will form an opinion about people who are protected, who have a really good public presence, and then they turn that onto real daily life people that they might come across in the street. So there's forms of physical abuse and harassment that quite often begin online and transfer into the street. That's happened quite a lot over COVID as well. Finally, I think really is something that we can talk about a bit more kind of as we go on as well, is a large kind of more subtle form of transphobia that really impacts on people, is the systemic exclusion of trans people from the media and discussions about issues directly affecting them. I have lost count of the amount of times in fact, I've just stopped turning the radio on now anyway, because it's just too offensive. But the amount of times I have listened to the radio or read a newspaper article or watched television and watched people passionately debate the existence of trans people, trans bodies, trans families, anything to do with trans people, and there is not a single trans person in the room. And this happens when legislation and policy is being developed, when it's being discussed, who gets to say yay or nay. For me, that is one of the strongest forms of kind of invisible transphobia that we see.
Fantastic. I think that was a really detailed breadth of just how transphobia can manifest. And I think, as we've already drawn parallels before, we've seen echoes of it in other manifestations of hate, and the fact that it isn't just this overt form of hate and discrimination that people maybe expect to see. And I think it's really important to catch the rest of them. I don't know if, Irene, you wanted to comment on anything that stood out for you.
I agree. And I like how it is organized with the 5 forms or spheres, if you like. I think that's really, really detailed. And especially using this podcast as a resource for our students, it's really helpful for them to understand the different forms that it takes. Moving forward, shall we talk about policy, which is really, really important in terms of how effective or ineffective it is? How many could policy even be transphobic in terms of failing to protect the trans community? And we have, examples of equal marriage, the failing of the government to ban conversion therapy for trans community, the exclusion of trans people from sports, not being placed in their preferred, in the prison that aligns with their gender performance. So many examples of how potential policy is failing the trans community in terms of human rights. So Jack, my question is policy effective in terms of protecting the trans community?
That's a really, really, really tricky question to ask, and I'm sure my critical scholarship is going to come out here in this question. But it goes back to also what I was just saying about the exclusion of trans people from discussions. When policy is developed about people without consulting with those people, then it's bound to fail. And we can see this across the board of policy that's supposed to be there to protect any type of minoritized population. And I think we have to think carefully when we consider the effectiveness of social policy and legislation to protect any minoritized group or groups of people, because ultimately, from the point of view of as an anthropologist, as a critical scholar, I would say that ultimately creating and amending policies to protect people in an unjust society is flawed to start with. So what do I mean by this? It's essentially a sticking plaster effect. It's a shoehorning in. It's an attempt to fit square pegs into round holes. And I would argue that it's a wrong way to deal with unequal societies. So I'll break this down a little bit, because this isn't me saying to lots of social policy academics and students that you should just go home and put your tools away now. It's not about that. It really is about really thinking what it is we're doing here. So it sets out that one particular group of people, so the policy comes about, I would argue, okay, that one particular group of people, so in the case of the UK, are white or white passing, cis-het, able-bodied, monogamous couples with middle-class aspirations are some kind of naturalized norm. And that policy and legislation is about giving other people or families who do not fit that description an opportunity to reach that normalized potential. So this will always fail, and it will always create exclusion for those not wanting to assimilate to a white, able-bodied, cis heteronormativity. So on the one hand, we can argue that current protections are moving towards less protection for trans and genderqueer communities, and this is bad for humankind across the board. On the other, we have a liberationist argument that actually benefits anyone, regardless of their identity, that striving towards inclusion in an unjust system is not the way we should be going about anyway. We're kind of doing things backwards. Now, where the latter argument becomes difficult is that whilst trans and genderqueer folk are excluded from protections in the type of society that we do realistically live in, they are subject to harm and violence as a result. And that's a real life thing. And this is where we do have to consider what policy is doing. They're objectified, they're othered, they're more likely to die from either direct attack or ending their own life. And that whilst they remain excluded, those that carry out harm, violence, or torture are actually protected in doing so. So we've only got to look at conversion torture being a prime example of that, okay? So the government have decided to go completely back on their words. They've excluded trans people from this idea around conversion torture. And what that does is it actually protects so therefore policy in that case is protecting the instigators. It's allowing them to do it. So as with anything, there's no simple yes or no answer. Inclusive and detailed policy is a very good thing. It's hard to argue against, but when groups in society have been so discriminated against to the point where the bare minimum becomes something they should be grateful for, then policy can also be a dangerous thing because it becomes about the bare minimum, and that's not enough. It becomes this kind of desperation of, you know, the crumbs that you're thrown, you should be grateful for. And that comes from what I was saying at the point is that our starting point is an unequal and unjust society, and we need to deal with that. And it's difficult to decide whether policy and legislation and rights-based discourse is actually something that can do that, because we've got to look at where it comes from in the first place. So rights-based discourse is inherently problematic because since its conception as a Eurocentric ideal, it's never resolved that urge to become a game of top trumps. So rights-based discourse within a neoliberal or a capitalist setting does not take into account intersectionality and collective identities. So by intersectionality, I mean being how social and political structures intersect to create multiple barriers for individuals and groups dependent upon their collective identities that they share and the context within which they share them. So I hope that's not a super convoluted answer, but it's not a straightforward thing. We live in a society and a societal structure that has legislation and social policy and ways of doing. So we need to think about what can we do to protect groups within the immediate, and that can be to utilise policy. But actually, when we take a broader, more long-term view, it's all problematic from the start because of where it comes from and who has the power and who has the power to decide. And until we do something about changing that power structure, then it's always going to be really, really problematic.
I think that was a fantastic answer. And I think for me, among all the things you've mentioned, two things that really shone out for me was first and foremost, the fact that we need to look at our policy and our social landscape through that critical lens, where actually right now, all the law and social structures are working to do is to create more homogenous groups of people. So like you said, it's not about understanding the nuances of gender or sexuality or race or ableism or, you know, whatever the issue at hand is. It's about trying to lump people together and be like, oh, we're all the same, when in fact we're not, and that's okay. But I think the other thing that he's touched upon that's really interesting for me, and I found it in my own research, is that policy is only as effective as our knowledge on the issue and our willingness to educate and change. I think without the education and the awareness of people in government, people that are making these policy changes, people in day-to-day society about each other, it's not going to work if we don't understand what identity is and why current attitudes need to change.
Yeah, and I think some of it is also just about accepting that you don't have to have a deep level of understanding, you know, because we've all got different ideas about what identity is and how it's important, you know, and trans people have got different ideas about what transness means and what being a trans person is. And it's actually, for me, there's a level of understanding, but actually there's a willingness to accept you don't have to understand in order to be kind and compassionate towards somebody. And it's not about, I really need to know what's inside your brain that makes you feel how you are. It's enough to say, I believe who you are and I accept that. And I believe that we've all got the right to live as we want without harming anybody. You know, and it's dealing with those issues before we try and play with and update and look at. You know, I've worked for years within and around the realms of social policy. I come from a social work background originally. I taught social work and social policy when I first started to become an academic, and I've always had this issue around who gets to create this, you know, who's having these discussions, who's even sat in your classrooms now studying this as a subject. Are we just continually perpetuating the same kind of stuff because we're not even getting the diverse groups of people through the doorway that we need in order to create new forms of policy? Are we even having discussions as to what does alternative policy look like? You know, who's it there for? Who does it protect? And most importantly, who does it exclude? Because the minute you're excluding somebody, then you're on the wrong path.
How does this affect the trans community, the exclusion of trans people from literally every aspect of society, the role of policy in terms of perpetuating that exclusion and promoting that resistance to the human rights of trans people? So how does it affect the trans community?
I think it affects the trans community in various different ways. If we move the focus from the trans community in a minute to the general public, or those who overtly are against anything that they don't understand, or generally groups of people who tend to be very violent and transphobic in their actions, who I truly believe on a deep level are people who are suffering some form of socio-historical trauma that they have yet to come to terms with or accept, and are therefore projecting it onto another group in society. But excluding trans people from policy and policy discussions is enabling those hate crimes and that transphobia to take place, because it's almost legitimizing it. It's just a little bit like I said about the thing around, conversion torture. By keeping trans people out of that change, they're enabling that torture to happen to trans people. So it impacts people directly that way. And from the outside world, it turns the trans community into political fodder. Therefore, it dehumanizes them. It makes them an object to discuss that is not human, doesn't have feelings, becomes personless. It disembodies a trans person from their body. It makes them targets for discrimination, and it actually distracts from the real issues, because by listening to trans people of various different backgrounds, of various different, identities and characteristics, any trans person, is likely to tell you that the issues impacting them are the children and young people who trans adults observe not wanting to be alive because the world does not welcome them. Adults also who end their lives either because they feel so much hatred from the world, or they are so desperate because they cannot access the healthcare that they need in order to live their life in peace. Homelessness, poverty, exclusion from education, discrimination by the state. These are the things that trans people care about. Trans people generally just want to live their life with their families and their friends in peace, and by excluding trans people from policy that is meant to protect human beings in society, you're basically creating an environment of conflicts and of arguments about ridiculously stupid things, and as a huge distraction. And all this is doing ultimately and very powerfully is silencing trans people. It's silencing, the majority of the trans population, which is a very small population. I've got no idea what the population is. We can only count, people that will hold their hands up to be counted. People that have held their hands up to be counted that identify as trans, genderqueer or non-binary make up around just slightly more or less than about 1% of our population in the UK. Within that tiny population, there are very few people who have the privilege to have, a public platform. There are people who are privileged because of other elements of the fact that they are able-bodied, or they are white, or they are well-educated, that people will listen to them. There are certain people that are acceptable trans people that the public will listen to. So when they do speak, what you will get is this, because of the amplification of things that happen online and in the media, you will get this opinion from the outside of, well, of course you can talk, because I've just seen a trans person interviewed on the television. We're not counting the fact that it's essentially generally the same trans person or same few people that are consistently getting interviewed. The rest of the trans community are just gradually being silenced because there's nowhere for them to speak, because nobody wants to listen to them, because they don't count. They're not seen as being counted, basically. So it massively affects the trans community in various ways. And that leaves me kind of always sitting in a space of conflict, because I'm very critical over governance, government, policy and legislation for reasons I've already explained. But at the same time, if we live in a world where it has to be utilised, then I need to have that conversation about how it can be shaped to actually help people as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult conversation to have. And I think, as you've already alluded to, it's not just the role of any one body within society whose task and responsibility it is to respond to these issues. So it isn't just the role of policy, on top of the fact that we need to be critical of the structures that are upholding and creating these policies. So I think off the back of all of this, I think I would like to finish with some recommendations for action. So whether this is for people who are in the area of social anthropology, social policy, hate crime research, or if it's allies among the general population who also have a key role to play, what are, first of all, some of the resources we can go to that you think we should be using, we should be accessing, and what are some really key critical points for action that we should be getting involved in?
Okay, so I think, my bottom line is about letting trans people speak for themselves. So when you're looking for resources online, or you're looking for books to read or podcasts to listen to, look for things that are trans-led, because there you will get the variety of life experiences and opinions that come from the lived experience. So, my bias is to most definitely always go to Transactual UK, because I work very closely with them, but actually they are a trans-led organisation. They do work together with cis people as well. They have the ear of government bodies and policy making, I'm losing the words now, departments, but a lot of the research that they carry out, as some of the research I support with them, is really important, because what they also do is they have the trust and the ear of the trans community as well. So when you look at their surveys and their research results of the projects that they work on, they tend to have a response rate that is a lot higher than other organisations, because there's a trust there. and trans and non-binary people will be interviewed, will complete their surveys because they feel that they trust what will happen with that data. And that really doesn't happen with a lot of other organisations. It's very, very difficult to get good data and information about trans people, because the more they're excluded from society, the more they want to switch off and don't want to talk to anybody because of the fear of what is going to happen with the data. But Transactual UK is a good place. Stonewall, in terms of allyship, are absolutely amazing. You know, they get a lot of flack in the media again for their choice to support, you know, and, you know, let's be honest, they've only relatively recently, you know, vocally supported the trans community, and, you know, good for them, because they're learning and they are willing to listen, and they are willing to listen and learn. LGBT Foundation, based in Manchester, are another brilliant source when it comes to data, surveys and understanding. They've done some amazing research over COVID as well, and access to healthcare. When it comes to children and young people, Mermaids and Gendered Intelligence are absolutely excellent resources. And I think, yeah, there's so much, there are so many people online in terms of producing content about that you can learn, you know, in an academic, in a political and in a social way about people's lives. It's really about investigating and understanding. In terms of sensible people on Twitter, which I think about to write about this, there's very few sensible people on Twitter, but actually I would always direct people in the direction of Christine Burns, who's an absolutely amazing woman, has done so much work for the trans community and on trans history and legislation since the 1960s onwards. She's written some really good books. She's edited a brilliant book on trans history, but actually she is always as well the voice of calm and reason amongst the trash that you get on there. And rather than list out a load of people you should be following on Twitter, what I would do is start off with somebody like Christine Burns and look at who she follows and who she interacts with, and do it that way in the snowballing technique. In terms of podcasts, there are millions out there. So as I said, yet again, just go back to trans-led stuff. There's some good stuff in terms of educating and on yourself on history as well, because, you know, history has been erased. There are so many important people within trans history internationally that there's a really good podcast that's called One from the Vaults. And that's a really good, just a deep dive into different people from all over the world from trans history, to kind of allow you to put those missing pieces of the jigsaw back together and see what's been achieved over time. I just think educate yourself and accept that you don't have to, as I said, you don't have to understand to accept people. You know, I don't understand brain surgery or rocket science, but I know that rockets go into space. And, you know, if anything ever happened to me, I'd be very grateful, you know, that somebody could operate and save my life. I don't understand how it happens. That's okay. I accept that. Always consult trans-led resources, listen to a variety of trans voices. Like I said, not all trans people are the same. We don't all agree with each other because we're human beings. Like, some of us are idiots, some of us aren't. Be an ally, you know, be an ally in your scholarship, in your work. Really think about who's in your classroom and who's talking. If you're educating yourself and you hear a lecturer say something that you know is off the mark, that you know is outdated, that you know is wrong, then if you feel safe to do so, have the confidence to challenge that. We need to be challenging those power dynamics in the classroom anyway. And if you have the evidence to show that something is wrong, then try and take that opportunity to do so. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, speak to somebody one-on-one. You know, if you hear somebody in your social circle say something that you don't agree with, and you don't want to challenge it in that moment, have a word with that person by yourself. You can speak to your lecturer, your tutor by yourself if you hear something. Start off at home with your own families. Have discussions on things that you've learned. Don't expect to be an expert. Nobody is. And don't worry about making a mistake. You know, my one rule is, across a lot of things, is when it comes to trying to find out the specifics and the personal things around the trans community, is if you can't Google it, then you shouldn't really be asking it. You know, if it's not available on Google, the information's hidden for a reason. You know, it's none of your business, basically. Ultimately, I don't know when this podcast is going out, but you know, if you don't want to turn up to trans pride events or pride events over trans season, why not donate money, you know, so that things like trans pride can happen. There is a protest in London on the 29th of June in Parliament Square, and this is a protest about entitled Not Safe to Be Me, because of the now cancelled, ironically titled government conference that was called Safe to Be Me, that was discussing LGBTQ lives in the UK, has got cancelled because they realised that nobody was supporting it, and luckily all the big organisations pulled away. But there is a protest on the same date anyway called Not Safe to Be Me, and the one thing that I think a lot of trans people need is allies turning up to their protests, or turning up in place of trans people at protests, because trans people are ultimately putting their lives and their bodies at risk when they go out on the streets to these protests nowadays, because of the way that things have escalated. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, there's a few different things you can do.
No, this podcast, just to say, will be going out in Pride Month, so anyone who is able to go or to donate money to these causes absolutely should. And I think off the back of the conversation we've been having today, I think it's really important to lay out, if we haven't very strongly insinuated this already, that trans people's lives, rights, they're not up for debate. We're not here debating trans people. We're here to say that trans people do deserve a place in society, and this is the ways that we can help, and that it is important, as you said, for allies to pass the mic and share the voices of trans people, but also for us to do the work ourselves. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for today, Jack. I think this has been a really important journey for many of our listeners to learn more about transphobia, and sadly one of the most marginalised communities in society. So I really appreciate the fact that you came on to talk about this.
You're welcome, anytime.
Thank you so much, Jack. It was wonderful, and your insight is really, really fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. On behalf of the British Society of Criminology Hate Crime Network, a big thank you.
Excellent. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.